This is our class on grasses with Kylea. She's our assistant manager at our Pleasant Hill location. We're really excited to have her present tonight. Kylea, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Awesome. Hi. Thanks so much for the great intro. I would not be able to do that better myself, but I'm learning. So my name is Kylea. As Jen already mentioned, I'm the assistant manager at the Sloat Pleasant Hill location. And I'm actually there today with several awesome grass and grass-like plants that we have available. So let's get started. So probably the best place to start this is with the question, what is a grass? Grasses are herbaceous plants that do not form woody stems, and that is a key thing about this family. It's because of that they tend to
Kylea, can you hear me? It's freezing a little. Is it freezing for anyone else? I'm not sure if it's just my view. Let me know if it is.
hear me.
Oh, you just froze for a second. So we missed the last. Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, there you are.
I am also moving again.
Okay. Okay, I think we're good.
All right.
Okay.
So talking about grasses still. So when I mentioned that they're one of the largest families of flowering plants, they literally have over 10,000 different varieties of grasses all across the globe, including a place we don't often think of plants at, and that's Antarctica. Kind of cool. One of the cool things additionally to that is actually that quite a few of us use grasses even more than we think, in that a good portion of the grains that we use when we're cooking, things like rice, things like wheat, even oats, are all seeds from grasses. We do carry some of those grasses as seeds, so that's something that's definitely worth a try, especially if you're in one of the areas that can handle, wind pollination. Make sure you're planting them fairly close together, and doing good clumps is really good when you're starting from seed. It's a really important thing, especially if you're looking for some of those edible varieties. Corn is another good example of that while I'm on that topic. Anyways, so I am mostly going to be talking about ornamental grasses, just because that's where my area of expertise happens to be. Unfortunately, if you're here for lawns, I'm not going to be able to give you much input on that. But feel free to ask a question anyways, and maybe we'll be able to help you out at the very end. Whatever I don't know, I'm sure Jen will be able to help me fill in on that. So since we're talking about ornamental grasses, let's talk about invasive plants first, and then we can go in depth on the non-invasive beneficial grass varieties that are out there. So to start, what's an invasive grass? As the term invasive indicates, it does well in our area. So why wouldn't you want to plant them? For the most part, it's quite simply due to the fact that they do too well in our area. They spread so quickly, and their seeds can have up to 10,000 little seeds in each of their blooms, which can spread like wildfire. That's why you see quite a few of the invasive varieties all along the California coast, where we've got that good wind that'll just carry it right along in its path. A couple pretty commonly seen examples in our area are specifically pampas grass. I've got a picture of that one here. I'm sure many of us recognize it as a fall decor staple in our worlds. But unfortunately, it is one that, if allowed to do what it wants to do, will not only take over the habitats of a lot of native and non-invasive varieties, but also can just suffocate the plants that are nearby because of how rigorous their growth can be. Another plant that is recently been added to the list of invasive plants, but is still a major concern, is the Mexican feathergrass. I've got a picture of that one here. And they're both really gorgeous grasses, which is why they spread so well. It's because we like them, so we bring them to places that we just don't know that they're going to do too well at. So, because we like the look of them, I have quite a few alternatives that I've printed some pictures of as well that are going to act as replacements, I would say. Let's see, is there anything I need to circle back to?
Everyone always, that Mexican feathergrass is a real, people love that grass, and I know and I understand it because it's super pretty, and it, it sways very pretty.
Mhm.
Do you have a substitute for that, just since you just showed that picture? Like,
I
what would
do.
you recommend as a equivalent non-invasive?
So one of my go-tos for equivalent non-invasives to the Mexican feathergrass is actually Mollenbergia, specifically the capillaris, which has these stunning pink blooms. We'll get those in when they're blooming, so usually that's midsummer for the most part when these guys are blooming, and that's when they've got that kind of stand out bloom. You can see there, that pink bit, that's their flower. And so when they're not in flower, they're just that nice, green clump towards the bottom, kind of in the same way that the Mexican feathergrass will grow. But its blooms are just, I would say, almost even more fantastic than the Mexican feathergrass is.
No, absolutely. It's incredible. I love that grass.
Also, if you're just looking for the Mexican feathergrass to act as like a border plant, one that I commonly use as a border plant that has just as much interest, might be a slightly different color palette, but it's got just as much interest, is actually Festuca glauca. Blue fescue. I have that one here in front of me today. I've got a little gray guy here, not as fantastic in person when it's so small, but they get quite large. Oh, no, they don't. They get about 2 feet wide, 2 feet tall-ish. Most of the family can have some slight variance in that. But they can definitely make a statement when you're using them as a border the way that I see Mexican feathergrass commonly being grown as well. So I would say those two are my key two to replace the Mexican feathergrass.
I like it. And I also like how I think one thing about grasses, and definitely in design, sorry, I'll stop
No.
talking in a second, but is also massing for effect, right? Like, because if you just put like one grass here and there, it doesn't have quite the impact. The thing about that Mexican feathergrass, since it spreads so crazily, there's always a big patch of it, and so it has that impact. And so anything that you go and replace it with, don't just put one, put like 5 or 7 or something like that. So then you really have that impact.
Definitely. I would definitely say plant in odd numbers just because, I don't know, it makes me happy and it ends up looking really good in the end. A little bit more natural than the evens for sure. But definitely when it comes to a lot of these grasses, if you want these plants to look fuller sooner, you will have to plant more of them. You can plant slightly less if you're willing to wait a couple of years for the plant to really thicken the way that they can as they, seed around them and, spread through their roots. None of these that I'm speaking of are going to spread aggressively through their roots. Just quick side note after I mentioned that one. But that's actually a big part of why in my display behind me tonight, I've got probably 20 plus grasses here, but that's when they make their impact, is when you have a lot of them. And especially because there is so much texture in this family. There's the softness and the weeping of something like the grass-like lamandra that's back here. And then there's, something a little bit more upright. If you want to go with something like a juncus, that's going to be straight upright. So there's so much character in the grass family, just in general. I am going to circle back to the invasive grasses question. just to round out what my thought process was, and that is just there are so many alternative beneficial plants that you can plant in place of these invasive varieties. When I talked about the Mexican feathergrass replacements, I didn't talk about the pampas grass replacements. And I actually have a couple recommendations for that as well. One of them being Muhlenbergia rigens. This one here, I've got some pictures of her. And I've also got a sample here next to me. Not super stunning when you can see me through it so well, but it'll thicken as time goes on. And as you maintain it over the course of the year, it'll definitely get real nice and thick and give you this sort of dramatic look to it. And this one's actually a native grass as well, which is, you know, just as cool to me. And the other cool thing about it is that they are carbon fixing plants, which is not something you hear often. There aren't very many out there that will actually help fix the carbon in the area. The other thing on top of that, I'm just going to preach about these Muhlenbergias, just because they're also salt tolerant, which is such a huge thing in our water in the Contra Costa area. We do have a lot of salt in our water and chloramine in our water, and the Muhlenbergia is, you know, not going to be as harshly affected as a lot of other plants can be. And they'll still give you that texture in your garden. Another replacement is one that you might have heard before, Calamagrostis. Carl Forrester specifically has blooms that are ridiculously huge, just like the pampas. They're a little thinner, but they're still going to get to 6 feet tall when they're blooming. Naturally, they're only about 2 feet tall, but their blooms give them that extra height that really gives them the wow in your garden in the fall time, which is really, really fun to see every year. So those are the direct replacements.
And would you, I've always thought of that Muhlenbergia rigens, however you say it, is evergreen or semi-evergreen. I mean, they're pretty evergreen, right? I mean, you can, yeah.
It really depends. I would say that if you're in the Marin area or the San Francisco area, they definitely behave more evergreen. I would say if you're over here in like Pleasant Hill, Concord with our frost, they can sometimes need to be cut back. It just depends on how they look generally more than anything else, especially because cutting them back can give them time to focus on other parts of the plant and just getting thicker for springtime. So I would say that they're a semi-evergreen for sure. So we're on to the topic of beneficial grasses, which is what I prefer to talk about, if I'm completely honest, because I'm always about helping our environment as much as possible. So let's just talk about why to plant a grass in the first place. So part of the reason why I always recommend grasses when you're looking for something in your garden, you're not quite sure what, is because they can be their own little microclimate habitat for birds or small animals or things like that. So if you're an animal lover, they're a perfect little, you know, accent, especially because they have that connection back to nature in that way. They also provide essential habitat for pollinators. So butterflies, bees, all that sort of thing, they'll hide in the, you know, the leaves of your grass plant and kind of create a cool little microhabitat in there, which is just really fun to learn about as you can watch it happen in your garden. The other thing is the various benefits of having them in your yard. They can create a lot of movement in the garden, which is something that you don't get as often with some other plant families. They'll definitely sway with the wind. You'll see them kind of flitting around, which is kind of cool, especially when they're blooming. And when they're not blooming, then they just still float with the wind, but they're just a little smaller.
I agree. They have that vertical element too. That's like super nice just to have for you know, texture.
Oh yeah.
Having some
always.
texture in the garden. It's very
I'm
nice.
always getting people asking me for some texture in like the shade gardens specifically. And one of the plants that I always like to recommend is actually this Hakona cholla. I think I get a star for pronouncing that, which is Japanese forest grass, which has just such a fun, flowy texture to it, and super cute little blooms. I don't know if you can see them on there. Kind of. They're kind of flowy, little cloudy sort of plants just to have alongside your camellias or your azaleas, anything like that. Something more structural, give something flowy next to it to give you some more textures in your yard. And it really can draw the eye upwards. If you've got something flashy towards the base of the plant, it'll definitely make it so that you want to keep looking at what's going on around it. Which I always find to be fun whenever you're designing a garden, is having that benefit. Or if you've got a particularly, neon spot in your shade garden, black mondo grass is also a great one. They act as a ground cover in shady areas as well, which is always a benefit because we all like not having to walk directly on dirt if we're walking in our backyards or our front yards, right? Have something a little nicer to walk on. And it does have little blooms as well, but its blooms aren't really that noticeable, I would say. They're much smaller than the grass itself gets. Now, I already mentioned that I like using Festuca glauca, which is this gray one I was holding not too long ago, as a border in the garden. But quite a few different grasses can act as borders in your gardens or as a good way to highlight your statement plant in your garden. So I like if you have a Japanese maple, or if you have like a palo verde, I like surrounding them by something kind of just different than what you've got there currently that'll help complement your design. Back down there. There are also grasses like Lomandra, which is a grass-like, as I've mentioned. It's one of my favorites, especially because it is evergreen, which means you don't need to really cut it back over winter or over spring. And its root system is actually incredibly deep. And what that does is it helps not only with erosion control, if you have a slope or a hillside that you're trying to plant on, but it also helps with water retention. It makes it so that your plant doesn't need to be watered quite so frequently once you've given it a couple of years to get really its roots established in the ground. Another one that does that is also going to be the Festuca californica. I unfortunately don't have any with me today, and I didn't get a picture of that one, but it is also a native grass that is in the same family as this gray one I keep pointing to over here. Can you tell it's one of my favorites? The Festuca californica also has a very deep root system that you can use not only for erosion control, but also as a drought tolerant option in your garden. So I've also got, I already mentioned that some grasses can be used as a focal point in the garden, like the pink Muhlenbergia I showed earlier in that picture, especially because of their very eye-catching blooms. But there are also quite a few grasses that can be used alongside things like fountains. If you got a particular area in your garden that is really wet and you really are struggling to find a plant that can survive there, look at the Juncus family. Look at the Equisetum. I don't have any of those with me today. They're not technically grasses, but they're grass adjacents, and that's going to be the horsetails. They can be somewhat difficult to remove, so just be cautious about that if you're planting anywhere close to wildlife. I would advise against it. But if you're planting in containers or near pond, like near a fountain in your home or near a pond in your home, Juncus can really add some texture around it and to give some protection from the sun that's going to be pretty harsh on your pond.
Juncus is super good if you want to do, if you've heard of the concept of swales. And I'm actually working on a garden now where I have a client who wants to direct her drain pipe to maximize the runoff on the water. So that sort of plant is perfect for that situation. If you direct your drain pipe, and maybe it's going to pool up at some parts in the year, in an area or whatever. The Juncus is great for that. Anyway.
Oh yeah. Not only just this Juncus variety, which is the Juncus blue dart, that's a much more upright variety. There's also one that's called Juncus spiralis that has the same sort of stiff leaf, except towards the, probably about 2-3 inches off the base of the plant. The leaves actually curl in kind of a like Medusa hair type of way. It's really fun. Sometimes we call that one corkscrew rush, just because it really does, remind you of a corkscrew in the way that it will show itself. And those grasses in particular work wonderfully, as Jen was saying, in areas that are very high water. And you can plant them alongside all sorts of different other high water plants. I really like planting the Juncus family with annuals, plants that I know are going to be higher water. So things like your petunias, things like your vincas, they're going to do quite well with. So let's see.
I keep looking at, because I think one of the most popular grasses that I see behind you that people love, especially this time of year, is the purple fountain grass. Yeah. So I feel like, I don't know if you're going to get to that, but that just keeps staring at me, and I know people love that grass. Yeah.
That's also one of my favorites as well. The only downside to it being that it is going to be a deciduous grass, which you can only win so many.
Yeah.
I will absolutely be getting to that one. That one is one of my favorites, especially because not only is the flower itself a nice purple tone, but the leaves of this grass. I'll pull the one from the other side. The other side isn't as. Oh, nope. Pulling this guy a little closer, just so we can see what I'm talking about. The leaves themselves are what's got this purple tone on the lower ends here. And then I'm gonna push the flowers real close towards you. They've got that nice poofy fall feel, in my opinion, and gems. Oh, they are some very fun focal point plants in the garden. And I would even say that those would work as a good replacement for the Stipa tenuissima as well. The Mexican feathergrass would be this one would be a good replacement for that. We call that one purple fountain grass. And there are other fountain grasses that are invasive, so just be mindful of that when you're shopping for your grasses. You want to look for Penum rubrum and specifically not, I have it written down, Penum cetaceum. That one is the crimson fountain grass, and that one is an invasive variety. So just avoid that specific Penum and you'll be okay. So I kind of talked to you about a couple grasses, what you can do with them, and things like that. I think we've gotten past the beneficial grasses portion of my outline. So let's do a slight care overview. When it comes to grasses, and because it's such a huge family, it's not really easy to give you a blanket statement of you need to water this much, you need to do exactly this, it needs this much light. It's a little bit harder than just that. If you guys have any specific grasses you want me to comment on, you're welcome to drop them below. But I am going to go over just a couple of the ones that I have here. So the Muhlenbergia rigans, which is that California native one that Jen and I both enjoy a lot. The Mandra, which is a drought, which is the grass-like here, as well as the Pennisetum, are all going to be varieties that I would consider drought tolerant. Once you've had them in the ground for 2 to 3 years, they'll have developed a root system that is deep enough that you don't need to water it nearly as often as you will the rest of your flowering perennials in your garden, which nothing but benefits there in my opinion. Just be careful which plant with them. Make sure you're planting like watering needs plants together. And then we're looking at things like Juncus, like I mentioned before. Calyxes, I would say, that's this family. They're technically sedges, technically not grasses, but they look grassy enough to me. These guys the juncus, as well as I would even say the mondo grass that I mentioned earlier. Each of those are going to be a bit more towards the medium water range, where you don't really want to let it completely dry out, but you can go for a little while in between watering. Just make sure you're paying attention to your weather. That's the key thing with a lot of these plants. So just make sure if it's really hot, it might be worth an extra water, maybe the day before. So watch your weather more than anything else. And then, so that's mostly the watering. Then light requirements. I actually tried to organize my display a little bit by how much light they need, where pretty much my Lamandra, my Miscanthus, my Mollivergia, and my Festuca are all full sun plants over here in Pleasant Hill. And even the Japanese bloodgrass is a full sun plant here in Pleasant Hill. And then when you go towards something like the mondo grasses, the caryxes, I've got a sneaky little variety in the corner you can't see, but each of those is going to be more of a shade grass in the Pleasant Hill area. What I will say is that maybe in Marin, maybe in San Francisco, you could manage giving them a little bit more sun and they would be happy. But over in Pleasant Hill, they will absolutely burn if you put them in full sun. So don't do that if you're in Pleasant Hill, Concord area, okay? Now, probably the most difficult part of grasses is figuring out pruning. There is so much advice on there online about, prune it this time of year, prune it this time of year. Hopefully I'm gonna demystify that a little bit while we're here. So what I would say is that when it comes to grasses, whether or not to cut them back does depend on your grass variety. When you're looking at something like a Festuca glauca or a Lamandra, you aren't really cutting those guys back unless the plant looks really dodgy. However, when you're dealing with something like I would say most caryxes, the Hocanachola, the Imparadas, not all caryxes, but some caryxes generally, actually. Pennisetum, this guy in the back. Each of these is going to want to be cut back. You can choose one of two times to do it. Either, later in fall, early winter, that range, where you're giving your plant some time to overwinter and focus on its root system. Or if you want to have your grass act as a overwintering habitat for migrating wildlife or non-migrating wildlife, you would want to wait until early spring to do your cutting. And that's just the big difference, is do you want this grass that's going to look kind of half dead during the winter time to exist for the wildlife, or would you rather it look a little bit more manicured? I'm personally somewhere in between the two. I have a couple varieties that I will keep full just for the wildlife because they're nice, big plants, very thick plants. If they're a little sparser, more often than not, I'll just go ahead and cut them back in the fall time. And when you're cutting them back, typically you want to cut about 6 inches from the very base of the plant. So that's not a huge amount of space. So you're giving a nice haircut for next spring. And when you're fertilizing, you want to go with something that is more nitrogen based. So something like a blood meal, or I use the tree and shrub food if I've got it on hand, because that's a 7-2-2 in the spread of nutrients. And of course, when you're planting, make sure you use Sure Start, because that stuff I use on just about everything, and it makes my whole garden pop off very quickly, which I am a fan of, just personally. The most fun part of grasses, in my opinion, is the fact that you can actually take some of the plumes and use them in little cut flower arrangements.
Oh, look at that. Cute.
Do a couple little plumes in there and it gives a great fall. You need to put like 20
and
more
seasonal
in
too. It's like seasonal,
exactly.
harvesty.
It feels very fall. It's perfect for like a dinner table when you're having friends over or family over or anything like that. Now let's see, when I'm looking at my notes, is there anything I've missed?
Kylea, can I, while you're on pruning, one thing that I heard at one point, and I've repeated it several times after, and I hope it's right,
Mhm.
is the Rubrum, because again, that's one that people like a lot. Doesn't like to get pruned in the fall. It's better to prune it late winter, early spring. So like kind of around Valentine's Day.
Mhm.
Um, because that grass can be kind of finicky until it's not, but like pruning a lot of times can affect it. So like if you prune it too early, it might not have a good reaction. Is that true for you? Yeah. Okay.
Pretty much found that with the Penum Rubrums that they definitely respond better when you prune them in the late winter, so like January, February time. And typically, when you're pruning, if you see a couple new blades starting, that's a good sign. You can keep pruning as long as it's not more than like 50% of the plant that you can see trying to grow. You can still do your winter pruning for it. And if it is 50%, just be very gentle about that. Um, the other thing I would say is that on the same lines of the Penum Rubrum being a little bit picky about what time of year it is to prune it, I would be very cautious about over pruning your evergreen grasses, especially the Festuca glauca. If it gets over pruned, it can get very, very kind of straw-like on the inside, at which point you need to go through and do some light pulling of some of that leftover plant material in that area.
I mean, the best thing about pruning too is that you really, if you don't prune, you don't have to prune. Like if you don't prune, then the next year's growth is going to be a mixture of dried leaves and fresh leaves. So by doing that prune, then you just have that fresh growth come up, and then, so it's just two different looks, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And some plants will definitely respond better if you prune them in the wintertime, especially. Just because cutting back all that excess foliage gives your plants a chance to really focus on the new growth they're going to flush out in the springtime. And yeah, it pretty much just depends on what look you prefer. Do you prefer a more manicured look, or do you prefer something that is a little bit more natural? Um,
Yeah, and while we're on pruning, because I think this is like relevant, but speaking of wildfires, fire hazardness of dry grasses. Guess what
yes,
helps that?
that's on my notes. Is
Yeah.
that if you don't plan on pruning your grasses, make sure you are not in a high risk fire area. If you're in a high risk fire area, I recommend that you prune them, much to the chagrin of some people out there. But grasses being too dry for too long definitely is a huge part of the reason why there are such bad California fires from time to time. Not just California, all over the world. As I said, grasses are everywhere. So just be mindful of the areas that you're in. Typically, I would say that if you're in like the Lafayette area, you might want to consider doing your pruning, even though the temperatures are going to be slightly different from the Pleasant Hill area. There is still a high fire risk in that area every summer. So just be very cautious of your areas when you're deciding what your pruning habits are going to be for your grasses.
That's
It's,
true of most things, honestly. Like even just keeping things so they're not super woody and dry, a bunch of like dead stuff. That's going to help with but their flammability. So,
yeah, and on top of that, actually, if you want to help avoid your plants drying out so much and avoid your plants becoming this huge fire hazard, make sure you mulch. Mulching is going to make it so that not only do you not have to water as often, but it will also help build up the moisture in the soil so that you don't need to worry as much when fire season comes around that your garden or house is going to be at risk, because that is a very important thing in California, I would say. So going, I think that's pretty much everything in the beneficial grasses and care overview categories. Let's see. Is there anything we missed? No.
I
What I
think
will
that's
say,
really good. No, go
if you
ahead.
cut back your grasses, don't forget to save the plumes for your cut flower bouquets. They look so nice. And I already kind of showed that, but it's just something I always forget. I'll chop all my grasses, throw them all away, and I go, oh no, 2 days
Mhm.
later.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. I mean, I just did a class, I think a couple weeks ago, but I did that because you can put them in, you can decorate pumpkins, obviously with the plumes and make wreaths with the plumes and stuff like that. So
there's so
I
much creativity.
love this time of year because you really just can go out in your garden and it's like it decorates for you. I mean, there's berries, there's grass, there's like seed pods,
The seed
all
pods
of
are
that
so
stuff.
time of
Yeah.
year.
hmm
All right.
Well, this has
So
been great. And I'm like, I think this is like really good coverage of it because we got the different varieties and the invasives and the substitutes for it. Um, what would you say? I mean, what are your kind of go-tos for like what you combine with grasses? Like if you're gonna put like flower any like do you just have like if you do grasses, do you like to put like stages with them or what do you like what's your a good combination like for a design?
depending on your lighting, there are a couple of different combinations that I like. One of my absolute go-tos is any plant in the Juncus family and things like cyclamens. I like cyclamen, primrose, and then a Juncus can give you a lot of attention. You can also combine things like if you're going for pot, at least that's what I'm kind of talking about when I say that.
Hmm
Also, if you're going for containers, you could do something like a lamandra, and they actually plant quite well with succulents. So you could do a lamandra and then a very dramatic aeonium sunburst or a Zwartkop. Those would look quite nice together. I frequently find myself combining Elijah blues with the medium bark that we carry, and then using that as your in between plant whenever you're planting things like lavenders or salvias or some of the more drought tolerant perennials out there, gazanias, I find plant really well with the Festuca glauca, which is definitely one of my preferred grasses, I would say. I use that one probably the most, and then I would follow that with the Muhlenbergia ragans just because of the benefits it has and the size and texture it really can give to a garden. And this one I combine usually with Zauschneria, maybe some Verbena de Lamina. I'm a big fan of that one, or Verbena lollipop looks really cute with this one. If you're going for a more native look, just depends on what you're doing.
I do want to say, Kylea said she wasn't going to talk about lawns, but I did want to just plug that there is native sod available. So you can, and you can order it through Slow, or you can order it through Delta Bluegrass. If you go to Delta Bluegrass website and look up their native sod, I use it regularly in gardens and I'm obsessed with it. But it's nice too because if you're, if you have a section that you're trying to replace with more drought tolerant alternatives, but you do like that grassy look, the native sod has a much deeper root system. It's like a carpet. You have that instant green that you can roll out and super effective. You can do it can be like more meadowy. So it's just like tufts of grass, or you can mow it like a traditional lawn too. So just that we have classes on that. So you can look at that. But I wanted to just note it a little bit because I know that that question comes up. So
Mm-hmm.
well, thank you so much. I mean, it's been 45 minutes. We had a good group. It's Wednesday evening and we're all filled with some ideas for incorporating grasses in our garden. I really appreciate your time and expertise, Kylea.
Awesome.
Of course, everybody, if you have any additional questions, feel free, you can email me and I can pass them to Kylea or you come into our stores. Our staff is absolutely there and able to help you and whatnot and go over your sun and water and whatever your situation is, and we can help you identify the correct grass for you. So I hope we're in fall now. It's like we're talking about grasses and it's fall. So I think it's like I love it. I love the vibe.